Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Art Break program about Linear B and what people wrote in the Bronze Age. My name is Hana Sugioka, and I'm a part of the Antiquities Curatorial Department here at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, California. I'm speaking to you all today from the curatorial offices at the Getty Villa, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people. Today's program is part of Getty's Art Break series, in which we hope to offer fresh approaches to thinking and interacting with objects in the museum's collection and those on display in our special exhibitions gallery, like today's program, which will highlight objects from our current exhibition, The Kingdom of Pylos, Warrior Princes of Mycenaean Greece. All of the objects that you'll see in today's presentation are currently in the galleries at the Getty Villa. This afternoon, we will be focusing on Linear B, a script used to write in an archaic form of ancient Greek during the Late Bronze Age. The majority of our conversation will center on the tablet from the exhibition that you see on this screen. It records a transaction of ingredients used to make perfumed olive oil at the site of Pylos, dating to around 1180 BCE. And we'll be using it as an example to see how Linear B documents worked and also how we might use them to learn more about the people who wrote them. I am a graduate student, and my own research centers on the art and archaeology of Bronze Age Greece and Crete. My work on the exhibition over this past year has really brought me closer to Linear B, closer than I have been before. And so for today's conversation, I couldn't think of a better person to join me than my friend and mentor, Dimitri Nakassis. Dimitri is a professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he's especially appropriate for today's topic because his forthcoming publication, Palace of Nestor IV, will present the corpus of Linear B tablets from the site of Pylos.
Thanks, Hana. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to quickly thank Hana and the Getty for making this event possible.
All right. Thanks, Dimitri. Thank you again for being here today. So, today's program will not only introduce you to Linear B, but showcase how scholars like Dimitri use it to learn more about people's lives in the Late Bronze Age. And today's conversation was born out of the incredible privilege of having 5 Linear B tablets on loan from the Hellenic National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And here you can see how they're currently displayed in the Kingdom of Pylos exhibition, with the tablet that you saw on the previous slide on the far left of the case. And so while I've been working on the exhibition over this past year and really developing the content for this case and working with the other curatorial team in design, I found myself returning to Linear B as an incredible way to connect people today with people living and writing in Pylos over 3,000 years ago. And so in the galleries, we invite you to read parts of the tablets for yourself and learn more about life at Mycenaean Pylos, but this is only scratching the surface of the wealth of information in these documents.
Great. Thanks, Hana. I thought I would start by just quickly unpacking a little bit the title of the exhibition in case people were a little bit confused about it, and it would help to sort of give some background. So, as you can see, the title is The Kingdom of Pylos, Warrior Princes of Mycenaean Greece. And I thought I would focus a bit on kingdom and Mycenaean. So we know that why kingdom? Well, we know that that Pylos was the center of a territory that it controlled or at least monitored. And we know from the Linear B tablets, in fact, that at least at the end of the Late Bronze Age, so in the 13th century, there was a king. The title of that king is Wanox, which is related. The later Greek word is onyx. It shows up in Homer as a kind of honorific term meaning lord. So kingdom is appropriate given that we know that there's a territory and that territory is ruled over at some degree by a king. We don't know an enormous amount about the king's powers and responsibilities, but the title is there. The second thing is Mycenaean. So this is a term that archaeologists use to describe an archaeological culture. So as archaeologists, especially in the 19th century, were trying to understand the history and prehistory that was in front of them, especially for prehistory where they don't have written texts. They started to see clusters of artifacts and behaviors that looked to them reasonably coherent. and they would call those cultures after they would give them names of some kind. So some of you may know that Crete, Bronze Age Crete, is called Minoan after the mythological King Minos, or legendary, perhaps, King Minos. Mycenaean is named Mycenaean because the first big settlement site that was excavated in the 19th century is the site of Mycenae in southern Greece. So we don't know what these people called themselves, almost certainly not Mycenaeans. At least the people in Pylos probably didn't call themselves Mycenaeans. So this is a purely modern term that we're using for convenience to describe basically southern Greece um, during the late Bronze Age, so around 1600 to 1100 BC.
And so on the next slide, you can see a bit of the area that Dimitri is referring to. So Pylos, which is what the exhibition focuses on, is circled in red in the southwestern Peloponnese, and we have Athens further inland. And so in the exhibition, we focus on the site of Pylos. It was home to King Nestor in the Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and he was this hero that fought in the Trojan War. And the archaeological evidence from the site demonstrates that Pylos was an important administrative center in the region with a complex palace that hosted political, religious, and economic activity, which you can see the plan of which on the next slide here.
Right. So we know that this site did bear the name Pylos in the late Bronze Age, and we know that from the Linear B tablets. So a bunch of Linear B tablets preserve the sign sequence Puro, which would have been read as Pylos in the late Bronze Age. Um, in fact, this site is very closely associated with Linear B, not just because it has the best preserved corpus of Linear B tablets anywhere in Greece or anywhere else for that matter, but because on the first day of excavations in April of 1939, Carl Blegen his first trench came down on a big corpus of Linear B tablets in the two rooms that you see there highlighted with a yellow rectangle around them. The one to the north with a bench which has the number 5. Those two rooms are called the Archives Complex by archaeologists, and Blagen's first trench came down on room 8. So on the first day of excavations, about a foot underneath the ground, Blagen's team started finding Linear B tablets. These survived the Second World War and are now being housed in the National Archaeological Museum in Greece, except for the 5 that are at the Getty right now. About 85% of the Linear B tablets that were found in the Palace of Nestor at Pylos were found in these two rooms. So it looks like these are rooms where the tablets are being processed and stored. I imagine that they were probably written in a better lit environment, but it looks like for short-term processing and storage, that's where these tablets were found.
And so after 1939, we weren't able to read the tablets until approximately 1952. And so on the next slide, we understand a lot more about how Linear B works. For instance, Linear B was not a language, but a script used to write this archaic form of ancient Greek. And it used a combination of signs such as syllabograms, logograms, and numbers. And so while we use an alphabet with letters and representing individual basic sounds, Linear B used syllabograms, so signs that correlate to syllable sounds, typically a combination of a consonant and a vowel. And these syllabograms were used to write out things like names, words, verbs. And on this slide, you can see an example of 5 syllabograms corresponding to the sounds of coriandana, the Linear B word for coriander. And this is coming from that perfume tablet that we were looking at the very beginning. And they also used logograms, or individual signs that stood in for commodities, like the sign on the far right that was used to stand in for wool. And then they also had numbers that would typically follow these logograms and correspond to an amount of a commodity at hand. But Dimitri, from your experience working with Linear B, What are some of the ways you might use the script to understand what people in the late Bronze Age are thinking about?
Yeah, I think the best place to start are the logograms. So I think maybe we can move to the next slide. Um, so most linear B tablets bear logograms. There's a small number of tablets that don't have logograms, but generally speaking, they have at least one logogram. Um, Logograms show us what the people who wrote these tablets were interested in recording. I think when I teach linear B, usually I talk about the dollar sign or like, a euro sign is the best example of a modern logogram. That is to say, it's a single sign that doesn't really participate in grammar in a traditional way, but tells you what you're counting, right? So you can see some of the logograms from the Getty exhibit here in the image. Um, Woman and man, right? So human beings, animals, often domestic, usually domestic animals, but there are some wild animals. So you can see horse and bull here on the display. Materials like gold, and I've got we have a bigger drawing of gold there on the left. Finished products, so manufactured products like swords, axes, spears, armor, and vessels. And then, of course, agricultural products. Like you can see here, oil and wine, but there's, of course, a wide variety of agricultural products that are mentioned in the text. And the texts are actually very, very much concerned with agricultural products, much more so than they are concerned with finished products, manufactured products. You can see that sometimes the logograms have bear resemblance to the thing that they're showing. If you look at woman and man and horse, that you can sort of squint a little bit for man and woman. For the horse, it definitely does look like the head of a horse. In other cases, it's a little bit more obscure, or there doesn't seem to be anything. Like I personally don't see anything in the logogram for gold that screams gold to me. It looks, in fact, to me, it looks like a little man, right, with his hands around his chest. Wine, uh, people say, and I think this is fairly good, that wine looks like a trellis. So, stakes, wooden stakes in the ground that grapes for making wine would have hung from. So there is a kind of conventionality to the logograms, just like there is the syllabogram. Some of them really look like what they're depicting, others are a bit more arbitrary. Um,
And
yeah.
I think a way to really understand what you're getting at here, Dimitri, and the role of logograms is by getting closer to one of the tablets that we've been talking about and referring to. So on the next slide, we're returning to that tablet of the perfume making. Um, Next slide, please. So again, this tablet referring to a transaction of raw materials for the making of perfume, which reads as follows line by line. Thus, Alxoitos gave to Thyestes the perfume boiler, aromatic ingredients for perfume, destined for boiling, coriander, and we have in blue those logograms, like our translation and understanding of what they stand for, 576 liters, Kyperus, aromatic, 576 liters, 157 plus we, 16, fruits, 240 liters, wine A, 576 liters, honey, 58 liters, wool, 6 kilograms, wine B, 58 liters. Dimitri, could you walk us through the structure of this tablet? Like, how would it be functioning in the administrative system at Pylos?
Sure. So I think we can probably divide the tablet into two halves, the first four lines and the last four lines. So you can see the first line tells you what's happening and who is the main, or at least one of the agents in this transaction, right? So Alxoitas probably gave, right? And then in line two, we find out the indirect object to whom he gave. What we don't know yet what he gave, right? That's the second half of the tablet. He gave to a man named Thyestes. Oxoitas is a man. Thyestes is a man. Um, yeah. The perfume boiler. So Thyestes is given a profession. right? Or a kind of area of activity that's relevant to this transaction. And then we're told what he's being given. Aromatic ingredients, tuea, for the boiling of perfume, right? For perfume destined for boiling. Um, that um, so that the top half of the tablet tells us what's going on, right? Who are the agents? Who are the two agents in the transaction? What is the transaction and what is the transaction for? This is actually a lot of information for a linear B tablet. Usually they don't bother to give us this kind of information because these are internal memoranda and receipts. So the people writing and reading these tablets, you know, pretty much know what's going on already. They're not writing these tablets for archaeologists 3,000 years later. Then in the second half of the tablet, we have the kind of the sort of the more material aspect of the transaction. What exactly are we talking about? So we're talking about Arab coriander and we decided it's called Cyperus. So two and lots of them, right? Probably around 600 liters. So we're talking about an industrial scale of production, industrial in scare quotes. Um, and those are written out, right? Coriander and cuparo are written out. We have some logograms we don't know what they are yet. Identifying logograms is a very tricky business. So you can see we have 157. That's just the number that's been assigned to that sign. If we don't know what that sign is, if we're not 100% sure what that sign is, we just leave it as the number. 157 looks like an infinity sign. That's the closest thing. And then there's a we, a syllabogram we is kind of sitting on top of the infinity sign. So that's why it's 157 plus we. There's lots of speculation about what that could be. And then we have carpos, fruit. We're 240 liters. We're not told what fruit, which is annoying, maybe. And then two different types of wine. So that's why we have the wine with an A superscript and a wine with a B superscript. They're written differently, and that seems to be very intentional. So that's why they're being differentiated in the transcription. So quite a lot of wine, a decent amount of honey as well. They're using a syllabogram me as an abbreviation for honey. All right, the Greek word for honey is meli, and in linear B it's also meri. So me as an abbreviation, and then wool, 6 kilograms of wool, and then a smaller, about a tenth of the original. We have right wine A to wine B is about 10 to 1 in terms of is exactly 10 to 1. I don't know why I said that. 20 to 2, right? Exactly 10 to 1 in a ratio. So something is different about the two different kinds of wine, um, but it's not clear why. Um,
And I think that's what's so exciting about these documents. At first, when I read them, I just see the basic list and I immediately go, this makes sense. Sure, you need things that smell good to make perfumed olive oil. But then as I keep going, more questions start coming up, like what is wine doing in this process, or wool even? And these are just questions that we'll be left with because the scribes, the person writing these tablets, they have this knowledge of the process that we don't have and we could only figure out through experimental processes today. But then there's also the personal aspect of things too, like who is Zalxoitos or Thyestes? Like, do they have any other role but besides perfume boiler or administrative official? And so I feel like a question that always comes up is how can we identify some of these people? Is there any way to know who wrote this tablet?
there is. Should we go look at the next slide?
Go look at the next slide.
So the people who wrote these tablets um, do not identify themselves in any way. And but they do have very distinctive handwriting styles, which is interesting in and of itself because a very small number of people would have written Linear B. Basically, just people working in the palace. We strongly suspect that these people are themselves administrators because there are very few people at any given time who could write Linear B as far as we can tell. There are about 25, 30 distinct handwriting styles at Pylos at the end of the Late Bronze Age. One thing that scholars have done really from the very beginning is look at handwriting to try to differentiate different people. And the person who wrote this tablet we call Hand One. He or she, they are the master scribe at Pylos. Hand One is the only person who corrects the work of other scribal hands. Hand One is a very particular way of doing things. Actually, this tablet is great for showing the way that these tablet writers change their minds. So you can see in the third line, he starts to write ze for zesomeno and says, oh, no, I'm going to write this on the next line, right? So he erases it with his thumb probably, or just the back of his hand, and starts writing it on the next line. Hand One is very particular, as you might expect for sort of archivist number one at a place like Pylos. So this is great, right? The fact that scribes or tablet writers write indifferently gives us information that we wouldn't have otherwise. If they all wrote the same, we wouldn't be able to differentiate between different writers. Some people have suspected that Alxoitas, the man who is in line one of this tablet, is himself Hand One, that Hand One is an administrator recording his own administrative activity. There's no way to prove that, unfortunately, but it is the case that Hand One does record a lot of the administrative activity of the men, of this very important administrator, who we don't know his title. We only know his name, his first name, Alxoitas. But that's plausible, right? And interestingly, most of these people who wrote these tablets refer to other people simply by their given name, which suggests to me that these people, these administrators, knew these other people personally, that were dealing largely with a face-to-face society. There are about 800 named people in the tablets from Pylos. So we're not talking about a huge number of people that are being recorded by personal name.
And then this example is giving us, of course, an exchange between two men, Alxoitos and Thyestes. But I'm wondering, Dimitri, could you tell us more about some of the other people that show up in the Linear B tablets from your own research?
Yeah, so this is something I was very interested in for my dissertation, looking at the different people who appear by name and tracking them, trying to figure out who they are and what they're doing. They seem to me to be kind of people that are interacting with the palace for activities of various kinds. A lot of them are, for example, bronzesmiths. A lot of them are shepherds who are tasked with keeping track of animals that are probably of interest to the palace for their wool. We're not just dealing with a super elite here. We're dealing with probably a broad elite group, right? About 800 people who are interacting with the palace enough that it makes sense to write them, to identify them by personal name. It's also not just humans who appear by name in Linear B tablets. Deities also show up by name in Linear B tablets. So that's kind of interesting. And at Knossos, we also have named animals, named worker oxen also get names, which is cool. Greek is a language that has gender. So we can say that about 95% of the names in the tablets are masculine and therefore presumably refer to people who are gendered male. But we also do hear about women. Again, only about 5%, which is not representative of how many women there were in the kingdom, but we do hear about them, which is interesting.
And we hear about one of them in particular on this next tablet, on the next slide from the exhibition, tablet EP 704. This is a tablet that describes a priestess, Aretha, and a land dispute. So what more can we know about her, Dimitri?
Yeah, this is a great tablet. It's the longest sentence in all of Linear B. All right, Aretha, the priestess, has and claims to have a true benefit. It's a sort of a guess of a translation, but it seems to be close to the etymology of the word that's being used. But the community says that she has leases of Kekemena land, so much seed. So this is interesting, right? Aretha is the priestess on the one hand. The local community, this Damos, seems to own and manage the land. And most people in these tablets have Kekemena land. We don't know exactly what that means, which is why I left it that way. The size of the land holdings is indicated by the amount of seed which is required to sow it. So this is 3.5 units of grain. That's a pretty big plot. And this is a very unique entry insofar as it records a legal dispute between two entities. So they're not disputing the size of the plot. What they're disputing is the legal status of the land. So Eritha is saying this type of land is a true benefit, and I'm holding this type of land for the god, probably goddess, given that female priestesses tend to be priestesses of female deities. Um, and then the local community is saying, no, 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 this is not special in any way. This is regular land. And presumably this has some kind of tax implications. Um, that seems to be why they're recording the size of these plots of lands. But it's neat because we don't see many women in the tablets, as I mentioned. Eritha seems to be a major player in her own right. She does have the power of the goddess behind her, right? She is a priestess, so that definitely helps. Um, and partly what drew me into Linear B in grad school what were these windows like this that Linear B, in prehistory, we're often looking for individuals and stories of individuals. We want to be able to tell stories, and focusing on people is a good way of doing that. And Linear B, as frustrating as it can be to work with, does shine light. Like, a dispute like this, we would only ever know about if we had administrative tablets from a palace. We would never know about Eritha and her dispute with the Damos if we had other kinds of writing, or if we didn't have writing at all. So yeah, it spotlights these specific moments and these specific disputes and these specific individuals, real people who lived in Pylos around 1200 BCE.
And I remember learning about Eartha for the first time and being so genuinely excited to see a powerful woman using her agency to advocate for herself in the record. And like Dimitri's saying, there is these frustrations of we don't know the outcome of her dispute, which is really disappointing. We want to know what's happening with Eritha. But it also, tablets like these help my research too. If I zoom out and think about wall paintings depicting women throughout the Bronze Age, like on this next slide, um, we have a watercolor of some of the wall paintings from Pylos of women processing, and we're able to use these details from the tablets to fill in gaps in the archaeological evidence of who are these women and why might they be important. And now we know, like, there is a priestess that has sizable power at this point. And all these other details, if we zoom out from the Linear B tablets, help us better understand other objects, like the thousands of wine cups, like the object you see in the center of your screen in the storerooms and pantries at Pylos. We have Linear B texts that tell us about massive feasts for whole communities. And we also have objects like the one on the far left, the little stirrup jar that could have been used to transport perfumed oil like that Diastes is recorded to make. And so we get these details, but it's hard to go from tablet to the real world.
Yeah, I think we focused on a couple of tablets that are in the exhibit, but one of the nice things about Linear B is that it does shed light on a lot of different aspects of the Mycenaean world. So politics, we've mentioned, the economy, we haven't mentioned much, but that's something that a lot of people have been very obsessed with. Society, we sort of touched on a little bit. Religion, we sort of touched on a little bit. So these are all dimensions of the human experience at Mycenaean Pylos that we would have very different kinds of evidence for if we didn't have the Linear B tablets. So these are, in some ways, boring administrative texts, but they also bring a whole world to life that we wouldn't know about otherwise. Um, it gives us a lot of detail about a single community living in southwestern Greece just over 3,000 years ago. So that's really unique, I think.
And it brings up a lot of questions, and we all want to know more. And so, on that note, why don't we open up our conversation to questions from the audience and see what everyone's thinking about? Let's
We stayed
see.
on time, Hana. Amazing.
We did it. I see one question about the perfume making tablet from Colleen asking, What sort of units of measure are they using? We notice that there's a metric system, but where is this converting coming from?
That's a great question. So, and it's actually really complicated. So they use a decimal system for counting. So we have ones and tens and hundreds and thousands. Um, and then they also have subunits. So, and they have different subunits for dry measures and for liquid measures. So, um, converting these units into units that make sense to us has been somewhat difficult. Um, and it kind of makes my brain hurt when I read about it. But basically, we're looking at other contemporary systems of measures in the Eastern Mediterranean, most of which are coming from the ancient Near East. Later Greek measures of weight. Um, and it looks like in the Eastern Mediterranean, during the Bronze Age and later, a standard unit of measure is the talent, which is about how much weight a person can bear. And it's usually around 30 kilograms. And there is a talent weight measure in linear B. So if that's about 29 kilograms, then the liquid measure should also be about 29 kilograms, which is 29 liters, right? Because a liter is liter of water is a kilogram. Anyway, so there there is some guesswork involved, and there's argument about what the precise number should be. People have also tried to um, measure the capacities of those vessels that Hana was showing in the last slide, and then trying to figure out, okay, can we figure out what the Mycenaean cup is, or the Mycenaean pint is? So it's a little bit tricky. And so, yeah, those absolute values should be taken with a grain of salt, but they're probably not way off. I, I feel pretty confident saying that they're not way off. Um,
I also am seeing a lot of questions about decipherment, decoding. How do we know
mm,
what the logograms are? So why don't we put through
yeah.
how does decipherment work?
So
And
yeah, we didn't mention the decipherment, and I saw some comments about that. So Linear B was deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952. He announced his decipherment on the BBC radio. You can listen to the radio broadcast. Shortly thereafter, he was contacted um, by John Chadwick, who was a professor in classics at Cambridge, and Ventris and Chadwick together really published the decipherment. Ventris himself was building on a lot of work of other people, including an American classicist who's living in New York named Alice Kober. There's a great book about Alice Kober written by Margaret Fox called the the Riddle of the Labyrinth. Yeah. Um, so Ventris was able to decipher linear B. To make a long story very short, Kober was able to establish principles by which signs could be understood not absolutely but relatively. So these two signs have the same consonant but different vowels. These two signs have the same vowel but different consonants. Um, and so Kober had started this process of relating different signs to each other. And Ventris basically continued that work after Kober's death. Kober died in 1950. Um, and so Ventris he basically had these charts of signs, and then a couple of lucky guesses or good guesses, maybe we should say, allowed Ventris to crack the code. I also wanted to mention one of the tablets at the Getty. So if you haven't been to the exhibit, you should go and check out this tablet. It's called the tripod tablet because the tripod tablet was excavated in the 1952 season, but Ventris hadn't seen it. And so when Ventris announced his decipherment, Carl Blagan, the excavator at Pylos, plugged Ventris's um, values into the tripod tablet. And the first word on the tripod tablet was tripodes, tripods. And then you can see the logogram for tripods is a tripod. It looks like a tripod. So that was that was really great because publishing that tripod tablet basically convinced all the doubters. When a new decipherment is announced, it's natural for everyone to be skeptical. Um, and uh, and so that tripod tablet really sealed the deal, and made it clear that Ventris's decipherment was correct because that tripod tablet had nothing to do with Ventris's decipherment. Ventris hadn't seen it. Um,
And so in the galleries, we really wanted people to be able to kind of relive part of this decipherment moment. So if you go in, you'll have lines guiding you to T Repode and also some of the tripod logograms. But it also raises the question of this repetition, I think is very odd for us when we look at these notes. But remembering that these are these administrative forms that are meant to track the commodities. And so having it in both forms was part of the process. I also have a question from Janine, who would be keeping these transaction receipts? One of the people mentioned in it, or an administrative department of the state. Why are these what we have, and what are we doing with them, really?
so yeah, the short answer is that as far as we know, or the operating assumption that seems to be basically correct is that all of these documents were written by and for administrators associated with the palace. So so we don't have, for example, as far as we know, we don't have any private archives the way we do in the ancient Near East. We don't have any archives that are being kept by other kinds of institutions like temples, like we do in the ancient Near East. These are all documents that would have been written and consumed by administrators working in the palace. It also seems like these are not long-term documents. The documents refer to next year and last year and this year, but there's one tablet, a new tablet that hasn't been published yet that refers to the year before last. So it looks like these tablets probably had a lifespan of maximum a year. Um, and maybe a tablet like this perfume tablet, even less than that. So these were short-term documents. Um, they're written on clay. We should have mentioned that. They're inscribed in moist clay and then allowed to air dry. And the reason we have them preserved is because the palace burnt to the ground, and the destructive fire that burnt the palace to the ground baked these tablets and allowed them to be preserved. So other sites that don't have Linear B tablets, it doesn't mean that they never had them. If you don't have a destructive fire, you will never find Linear B tablets. This, at least, as far as we know. And you can really see the destruction when you handle the tablets. I think not so much of the ones that are on display. The ones on display are nicer. But you can sometimes see along the breaks, you can see the break at the bottom of this slide. Sometimes it'll be gray on one side of the break and red on the other side of the break. So because they were fired in different environments, this is very chaotic environment in which the tablets were fired. So they seem to have broken first and then were fired in different environments. And so you get different colors, you get different textures, you get different sizes. Sometimes the fire really expands the size of the clay. And so you have these joins that are clearly correct, but they don't quite fit physically because of the different sizes. Um, yeah, sorry, I should stop talking.
No, we can
Did
also see some of the evidence of the burning, like just the sheer color of the tablet, like we're looking at right now, like this dark gray, burnt black. Most people, I think, upon first seeing them, think they're inscribed stone, but really, what Dimitri's talking about is there's these clay tablets that we're inscribing with a stylus of sorts on the wet clay surface, and then on the last tablet that we saw, you could really see the variation of the temperature of the fire too. Like it's not one solid color, which is really fun in comparison to the other objects in the gallery. And from Rick Spear, do we have any knowledge of how people were chosen for scribe training and thus became literate, or how they're learning to write? Do we have any evidence?
We have a lot of speculation. We don't have a lot of positive evidence. The fact that they're not writing exactly the same way, suggests to me that, and to everybody else who studies this stuff, that they're not being trained in a centralized school. Um, we know what that looks like from the ancient Near East. There's a lot of homogeneity in writing practice from the ancient Near East when um, scribes are being taught in a scribal school. And we know about the curriculum in the ancient Near East too, right? They're copying out great works of literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Um, we don't know that about the scribes here. Like I said, we think that they're probably administrators. themselves. There's been some speculation that this would have been a kind of father to son, mother to daughter type, keep it in the family type thing, which makes sense given that we're dealing with a pretty hierarchical society and that we're dealing with um, administrators who are working very closely with the upper administration of the palace. Um, so the differentiation suggests that we're not dealing with highly centralized schools, but rather a kind of decentralized training system. It's wild to me that, it's clear that different scribes have different ideas of what the signs ought to look like. So it's not just that some people's handwriting is different from others. It's that some people, if Hana and I both write an A, because we're taught in an American public school system when we're private, I was in a public school system anyway. Our A's are going to look similar. But some of these scribes, their signs are pretty divergent, which I think is neat.
We also have the great question that we also didn't touch on of why is it linear B and not linear A?
Yeah. You can blame Sir Arthur Evans for that. So Evans was an English archaeologist, and he excavated the great site of Knossos in central Crete, the biggest and most important site in the Aegean Bronze Age in all periods, basically, until, well, anyway. So, and Evans found three different writing systems at Knossos. One which we call Cretan hieroglyphic, which is not hieroglyphic. It doesn't have anything to do with Egyptian hieroglyphic. It's just the signs are more pictorial, like Egyptian hieroglyphic. And then Evans found two linear scripts. So scripts where the signs look like the signs you see in front of you that are curvy linear, shall we say. And Evans called those linear A and linear B. So two scripts where the signs are more linear and one script where the signs are more hieroglyphic or pictorial. So linear A and Cretan hieroglyphic are undeciphered scripts. We cannot read them. Linear B is effectively derived from linear A. Linear B um, takes most of the signs from linear A and uses them to write Greek. So it's important to remember that there's a difference between scripts and languages, that linear B is a writing system, but the language that it's writing is an archaic form of Greek. So even though this Greek is being written in syllabograms, it's not being pronounced right in syllabograms. No one's saying akosota, right? That's just the way they write out the name Alexoitas.
I guess on that note, we have a question about names in linear B because we
Mhm.
got to talk about three of them, but what are other names for Pilos? Are they similar? Do you have favorites? What are some of the meanings, perhaps?
Yeah, so many of the names that we have are transparently Greek. That is to say, they're similar to later Greek names. You can etymologize them as such. Um, the most famous names in Greek are compound names. So that's to say they're compounded with two different words. Um, so my dissertation, I began with men who are called bronzesmiths, chalkewes, and chalkos is the Greek word for bronze. So these are men's having to do with bronze. And many of the bronzesmiths have names that refer to smithy activity. So there's a guy called Manasi Wergos, he who is mindful of his work. Um, I think that's a great one. Um, you also get military names like the slayer of the host of the army slayer. So you get compound names like that. You also get simple names like Thyestes is a simple name, right? Thyestes comes from the Greek verb thuo, which means to make something smoke. It's the verb that's used for animal sacrifice in Greek, because you burn the fat and the bones of the animal, but it's also used for burning incense. So it's kind of interesting we have a Thyestes. So A, Thyestes is known from later Greek mythology, right? He's a member of the House of Atreus. Not a very happy life, but hopefully this Thyestes had a better one. And his name is etymologically related to a verb of making incense smoke, and he's a perfume maker, right? So he there's um there's something really neat about that you could translate Thyestes as like the perfumer. Um, or Thuestes in later Greek also means pestle, so he could be Mr. Pestle. But anyway, so yeah, so the names are really great. There's a Spanish scholar, Jose Luis Garcia Ramon, who's written a whole bunch about Mycenaean names, and he has been preparing a kind of lexicon of Mycenaean names, which I think everybody is really excited about. Um, Someone I saw a note asked if we know the name of the Mycenaean king at Pylos, and the answer is maybe. Um, and his name is confusing, and no one knows how to etymologize it exactly, or people disagree about how to etymologize it. Um, but it could be a military name. In fact, it could be the man who takes pleasure in the spear. Um,
Very fun. All right, we're getting right towards the end of our program. So thank you all again for joining us today on Zoom. And thank you also again, Dimitri, for joining me. Let's just see if there's one more question that potentially sparks some interest for you, Dimitri. Tablet. There's A2 at the end of the syllable for the word coriander. The
oh
symbol,
yeah,
don't see that. Simple, what does A2 mean? Do you
yeah.
want
So
to
sorry, this is a confusing thing that linear B scholars did. So when when they started deciphering the script, there were some signs where it was kind of unclear what exactly they were. Um, so A2, it was clear was some version of A, but people weren't sure exactly what it was. And it's clear that now that A2 is an A with an aspiration before it, so ha, something like that. So A2 just means it's a different version of A. It's like, A prime or something like that. There's also an A3, which is confusing. And sometimes scholars have decided once we've decided for sure, we know for sure that this is A2 is Ha, we'll change the way we write it. And other times we haven't done that. So sometimes if you look in early publications, things look a little bit strange. Yeah, this is one of the things that's I think a lot of graduate students find frustrating, Hana, about linear B is that there's lots of unwritten rules, and up until recently, no one really explained them, and you just sort of had to figure it out for yourself. And so it's like this weird world where with all these strange rules that nobody ever spelled out for you. I guess lots of academic subfields can be like that.
No, it's very true. And it's like one of those fun relics from the decipherment of we know tracking the similar values and figuring out what is what. But
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done still. There's I know one of the questions I'm always asked, Hannah, you'll be asked this, is like, oh, you work in Greece, but haven't we found everything in Greece? And the answer is no, right? So the same thing with linear B. There's an enormous amount of work that's been done, and obviously we've made an incredible the discipline has made huge strides, even since the decipherment, which has to be counted as one of the greatest intellectual accomplishments of the 20th century. Um, but yeah, there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. And one thing I sort of wanted to say that's what's great about linear B is it gives us questions to ask, right? We can ask why wine, why wool, what are these fruits, right? We wouldn't have those questions if we didn't have the tablet to begin with. So these can be frustrating windows, but they're also windows that allow us to ask more questions. And I also wanted to mention, right, that Cynthia Shelmerdine, one of my professors, is also doing a presentation at the Getty about perfume making in the Mycenaean world. So that's something else to look at. And she's the real expert. And as I mentioned, she taught me. So that's another thing to if you're interested in perfume making, Cynthia is the person to ask. So there's lots of Getty activities involved around this exhibition that are well worth your time.
And we're really excited, especially for the perfume workshop. And thank you again to everyone for attending this event and listening to us talking about Linear B and all of the ways it vexes us. And I hope this was a way to get a little deeper below the surface, so to speak, of Linear B and what we present to you all in the galleries. And I encourage you to check them out and see them while they're in California if you can. It is really an incredible moment. So thank you all.